The file landed on the table, the way files always did when someone had already made up their mind. Flat, deliberate, with just enough force to say this is final. Colonel Ashworth didn't look up when Sergeant First Class Tegan Novak walked in. He was reading something on his desk, or pretending to, and she stood in the doorway of the forward operations room at CFB Petawawa for a full 7 seconds before he acknowledged her existence. "Sit," he said. She sat. The room smelled like burnt coffee and old carpet. Through the single window, snow was coming down sideways off the Ottawa Valley, the kind of cold that made Ontario feel like punishment. Novak had grown up in Thunder Bay. She knew that kind of cold. It didn't impress her anymore. Ashworth finally looked up. He had the face of a man who had spent 30 years being right about things and was mildly annoyed that the world kept requiring him to prove it. "You requested a transfer to the sniper section," he said. "Yes, sir." "You've read the assessment criteria?" "Yes, sir." He leaned back. "Then you understand why I'm looking at this request the way I'm looking at it." Novak didn't answer. There was nothing to answer. He was looking at it the way men like him always looked at requests like hers, not with hostility exactly, but with a specific kind of patient skepticism, the kind that had been practiced so long it had become invisible to the person wearing it. "You have an exceptional service record," Ashworth said. He made it sound like a complication. "Kandahar, 2012. Helmand, the advisory rotation in Jordan. Your physical scores are..." He paused like he was checking something he'd already memorized. "Above the male average in 3 of the 4 categories. 4 of 4, sir. The reassessment last month." He didn't blink. "The section leader is Master Warrant Colquhoun. He runs a tight team. They're going to Ramstein in 6 weeks, and there's a deployment cycle attached, I know. Colquhoun asked me, specifically, not to send him anyone who needs time to settle in." "Then don't send him someone who needs time to settle in." Ashworth looked at her for a moment, not the skeptical look. Something else, briefly, something that might have been assessment, real assessment, before it closed back down. "I'll think about it," he said. She walked out knowing he wouldn't. Master Warrant Officer Colquhoun was not a tall man. He wasn't supposed to be. Snipers rarely were. The biology of the thing, the patience of it, didn't tend to grow in people who needed to fill up a room when they walked into it. He was compact and weathered, and had hands that looked like they'd been borrowed from someone twice his size. He shook hers once, firmly, and then turned around and walked toward the range without looking back to see if she was following. She followed. The section was 6 people. Gagnon, who was from Saguenay and spoke to almost no one. Travers, who had played junior hockey and never entirely stopped acting like it. Fiorentino, the youngest, with a face that still looked surprised to be there. Wick, who was missing part of his left ear from an IED outside of Panjwai in 2010, and referred to it only as the renovation. Who shook Novak's hand when Colquhoun introduced her and said, "Good," with no further context, in a tone that meant he'd already decided something and had been waiting for the right file to confirm it. The others said nothing. Travers looked at the ground. Gagnon looked at the target frames. Fiorentino looked at her like she was a math problem he wasn't sure he'd been given the right formula for. "We run a 6:40 start," Colquhoun said. "You're late once, you run. You're late twice, you talk to me. You miss a qualification window, you're gone. We don't have time for people who aren't where they're supposed to be." "Understood. You'll start on the C-14. Ranges at 400, 600, 800. We'll see where you are." She was at 940 meters on her 3rd day. Fiorentino stopped pretending not to watch. Travers said something to Gagnon at the cleaning bench evening that she didn't fully catch, but she caught enough the word luck. And Gagnon's flat response, which was just one syllable in Quebecois that she'd heard before and didn't require translation. It wasn't luck. It was 10 years of getting up before everyone else and staying later than everyone else and understanding that the thing between you and the target was not the bullet. The bullet was easy. The bullet was physics. It was everything that could go wrong in the moment before you pulled the trigger. The breath, the doubt, the 2/3 of a second where your brain was still deciding whether your body was allowed to do what it was about to do. Novak had stopped having that 2/3 of a second somewhere around 2014. She didn't know exactly when. She just noticed one day that it was gone. Colquhoun came and stood beside her after she'd shot the 600-meter string. He didn't say anything for a while. He was looking at the paper target being retrieved, and she watched him register the grouping, and she watched him not say anything about it. "Wind was variable," she said. "I called it a hair too conservative on the last 3. he said. I know, he said. I was watching. He paused. So were the others. She didn't look at the others. That's fine, she said. The exercise was supposed to be a standard rotation. Cold weather stalking package, Northern Ontario terrain, 3 days in the field with a designated observer and 2 target zones. Fiorentino was her observer. She hadn't requested him. Colquhoun had put them together, and she'd thought about it for about 30 seconds before deciding it was either a test or it was neutral, and either way her job was the same. They were 9 hours into the first field day when things stopped being standard. The scenario called for a simulated high-value target extraction at a decommissioned training compound 22 kilometers east of the main base. Standard OP for role players, blank fire. She and Fiorentino were positioned at a ridgeline 700 meters out with a sight line on the compound's eastern gate. Wick and Travers were in the approach corridor. Gagnon and Delacour were on the secondary. Nobody had briefed for ice. The first signal came from Delacour at 1422, a burst transmission. 3 clicks, which meant movement, unexpected wait, then silence. Then Trevor's voice on the radio, low and quick, saying Gagnon's down, Gagnon's down. It's the creek bed. The ice came through. Not the scenario, real. Novak was already moving before Fiorentino finished processing the transmission. She heard him behind her, keeping up, not saying anything useless. The ridge was steep, and the ground was frozen in that particular way that looked solid and wasn't. And she went down it in a controlled slide, with her rifle across her back, hitting a stand of spruce at the bottom, and using it to arrest her momentum without breaking anything important. Gagnon was in the creek, not under. He'd caught a root on the far bank with one arm, and the current wasn't running hard, but the temperature was, and he'd been in for at least 3 minutes by the time she got there. Travers was at the bank, trying to reach him with 2 was short, and making it worse with each attempt. Stop, Novak said. Travers stopped. She unclipped her pack, pulled the paracord from the outer pouch, tied a fixed loop, and threw it to Gagnon in one motion. He got it on the second pass. She braced against the root stand. Fiorentino got behind her without being asked, and they brought him in. Gagnon's hands were already past cold. He was shaking in that deep muscle way that came before hypothermia settled in and stopped feeling like shaking. She stripped his outer layer, got her own dry mid-layer around him, called Wick on the radio, and gave a clear grid and situation report in under 30 seconds. The evacuation took 47 minutes. Gagnon lost feeling in 2 fingers for 6 hours. He got them back. He was in the medical bay drinking bad tea when she came to check on him that evening, and he looked at her for a long moment with his bandaged hands wrapped around the mug, and he said, in English, which she'd noticed he rarely used. Neither did you, she said. You held that root. That was panic, he said. Panic works, she said, when it's trained. He almost smiled. Almost. Colquhoun pulled her aside the next morning. They were standing outside the operations tent, and the snow had stopped, and the air had the particular clarity that came after a front moved through. Everything sharp-edged and very still. He had a mug in one hand, and he wasn't offering her any, which she noted. Travers told me what happened, he said. The incident report is filed. I'm not talking about the report. He looked out at the tree line. He said you took command. Someone needed to. He's a corporal. You're a sergeant first class. You outrank him. Rank wasn't the issue. The issue was that Gagnon was in the water and the branch wasn't long enough, and someone needed to stop Travers from making it worse. Colquhoun drank his coffee. He didn't like it, I know, he said. Colquhoun paused, and she could hear him choosing words. That you were aggressive. She waited. He'll get over it, Colquhoun said. She looked at him. That's all, he said. Good work. She turned to go. Novak. She turned back. Your shot group's on the 640 yesterday morning, he said, before the incident. Were you rushing? No. They were tighter than your previous best. I know. He nodded once, like he'd confirmed something. Then he went back. Stein was a layover. The operational tasking was further east. A joint exercise with coalition forces in a mountainous corridor that bore a specific kind of resemblance to terrain she'd worked before, and preferred not to think about too carefully. The brief was delivered by a Canadian liaison and 2 American officers from a special operations unit, whose unit designation was mentioned once and not repeated. The American section leader was a chief warrant officer named Balthazar. He was from somewhere in the American Southwest and had been doing this for longer than she'd been in uniform, and he had the specific quality of a person who had fully evacuated all performance from himself. No posturing, No volume, just information and action, and the precise economy of someone who had stopped wasting time somewhere around the age of 30. He shook her hand when they were introduced. No pause, no recalibration of expectation. Just the handshake and then, "Your dossier says Hellman, 2015? Yes, yes. Sangan Corridor? Area? Yes." He nodded. "We're going to need your elevation work on the eastern observation point. Your range estimates have been solid in the training cycle. Delacour is going secondary. You comfortable with that?" "Good." He turned to the map. That was it. Travers was watching from across the tent. She could feel it. She'd gotten used to being watched, not because it was comfortable, but because she'd made a decision a long time ago to treat it as ambient noise, like wind, like distance, like all the other things that were real but manageable. You didn't argue with wind, you calculated it. The first operational day was uneventful. The second was not. They were 12 hours in when the signal came that the primary corridor was compromised. Not by OPF or in the exercise sense, but by an actual incursion. A small armed element that had moved through the eastern valley without appearing on any of the morning surveillance. Real, not a scenario. Balthazar's voice on the comms was exactly the same as it was in the tent. No elevation. Eastern ridge. Confirm you have eyes. Confirmed hours. I have 4 elements moving northeast. Grid. She called the grid. They're not coalition, they're carrying. I'm counting AKs in what looks like a PKM on the trailing position. Distance, 1,100 meters. A pause. Not hesitation calculation. "Colhound," Balthazar said. "Your call." And Colhound said, "Novak, you have it." Not a question. She settled into the position she'd held for 6 hours. Everything that could be adjusted had been adjusted. The wind off the ridge was 6 knots, variable. And she'd been reading it for the last 2 hours in the way you read a language you've spoken long enough that you stop translating. It was just meaning, now, direct. She called each position as the element moved. She tracked. She did not fire. The rules of engagement were specific, and this was an observation tasking, not a kinetic one, but she held, and she gave Balthazar's team the information they needed to redirect the ground elements in time. And when the armed group turned northeast and moved out of the corridor without the encounter becoming something worse, Balthazar came back on comms and said 2 words. "Good eye." That was it. But she noticed later that Travers had been very quiet since the comms came down. Not sulking quiet, something else. The quiet of someone recalibrating. The debrief was held in a converted storage room at the forward operating base, folding tables and overhead fluorescents, the kind of light that made everyone look like they hadn't slept, which was accurate. Colhound presented. Balthazar sat across from the room's senior officer, a brigadier general named Hadfield who had flown in from Stuttgart and had the air of someone who made decisions in rooms like this several times a week and had not yet stopped finding them interesting. Hadfield asked about the Eastern Ridge observation. He asked specifically. He asked who had the eyes, who made the call, what the conditions were. Colhound said, "Sergeant First Class Novak held that position for 6 hours in suboptimal conditions and gave us real-time tracking that redirected the ground element and avoided a contact situation." Hadfield looked at the table for a moment. Then he looked at Novak. "How did you read the wind at that range?" "History," she said. "The ridge had a consistent pattern from 0800. By 1400, I had enough data to call the variance. You were compensating, what, 3.4 MOA, sir, variable between 3.1 and 3.7. Hadfield looked at Balthazar. Balthazar said, "She was the right person in the right position." Hadfield nodded slowly. He picked up his pen and wrote something. She didn't know what. She didn't ask. After the debrief, as people were filing out and the fluorescents were doing their worst to everyone, Travers came and stood beside her. He looked at the table. She looked at the table. "I was wrong about the creek," he said. She waited. "Not about following your lead," he said. "About after. What I said to Colhound. About you being aggressive. I know what you meant by it. I know you know." He was quiet for a moment. "That's what I'm saying sorry for." She looked at him. He had the uncomfortable honesty of someone who had grown up believing something and had recently discovered it was wrong and hadn't finished being embarrassed about it yet. She recognized that look. She'd seen it before. It was better than the other kind. "Accepted," she said. He nodded and walked out. Fiorentino, who had been pretending to pack up his kit near the door, met her eyes briefly and looked away. And she could see him deciding something, the way young soldiers decided things, quietly without announcing it, the decision visible only in how they stood differently afterward. She called her father that night, from a satellite phone in a corridor outside the sleeping quarters. He was retired CF, a former warrant officer from a time when the arguments about who belonged where had been louder and less careful. He picked up on the second ring. "How is it?" he said, not a question exactly. "Cold," she said, and then not cold. Then cold again. He laughed, which was a specific short sound she'd been hearing her whole life. "Your grandmother would have something to say about the cold. She had something to say about everything." She did. A pause. "You're okay." Also not a question. "Yeah," she said. "I'm okay. Colehound treating you right?" "He's treating me correctly." Her father was quiet for a moment. He understood the difference himself, in a different decade, in a different set of rooms. "There's a difference between correctly and right," he said. "I know. But correctly is enough to start." He made the sound again, not quite a laugh, something more considering. "You sound like your mother. Mom would have told you correctly wasn't enough for anything." "She would have," he agreed, "and she would have been right, but she also would have taken the correctly and built from there." Novak leaned against the corridor wall. The base was quiet at this hour, the particular quiet of people who were sleeping hard because the work required it, not because they were at rest. "Balthazar told Hadfield I was the right person in the right position," she said. Her father didn't say anything for a moment. Then, "He's right, I know. But it matters that he said it in the room." "I know that too." The line had that slight delay that satellite calls always had, the one that made silences feel slightly longer than they were. She'd had this conversation with him before, in various versions, since she was 22 years old, and had walked into her first unit and understood almost immediately that she would be having it in some form for a very long time. "Get some sleep," he said. "You too." She hung up and stood in the corridor for another minute, listening to the base settle into its nighttime sounds. Generators, wind off the ridge, somewhere the low voice of a radio still running. The kind of sounds that stopped being noise and started being background after enough time, until they were just the texture of where you were, just the shape of another night in a long series of nights that had brought her here. She went to sleep. The section flew back through Ramstein and landed at CFB Trenton on a Tuesday afternoon in February, which meant the tarmac was wet, and the sky was the specific pale gray of southern Ontario in winter. And the cold that came off Lake Ontario when they opened the aircraft doors was different from the cold they'd left. Wetter, more domestic, the cold of home. Colehound was the last one off. He stood at the bottom of the ramp and let the section move past him, and when Novak reached him, he fell into step beside her, which was something he hadn't done before. "Hadfield put in a recommendation," he said. She kept walking. "For what?" "Advanced qualification, the long course." She knew what the long course was. Everyone in the section knew. It was the kind of thing said with a specific weight in sniper sections, the way certain words held more than their syllables. "He put it in before he left Stuttgart," Colehound said. "He called me, before the debrief paperwork was even filed." She thought about that. "Why are you telling me out here?" she said. "Because in there," he nodded toward the terminal, "there are administrative people, and it becomes a thing. Out here it's just information." She looked at him. He was watching the terminal, not her. "Colehound." He looked at her. "Did you recommend me before or after Ramstein?" He held her gaze for a moment. The wet wind came off the tarmac. A ground crew vehicle moved past, orange lights blinking. "Before," he said. She'd thought so. She'd thought so from the morning outside the operations tent, when he'd asked about her shot groups, when he'd said good work and gone back inside. She'd thought so from Delacour's handshake on the first day, which had been too knowing to be entirely neutral. She'd filed the thought and not touched it, because there was nothing useful to do with it until it was confirmed. "Okay," she said. "You'll need to submit the application yourself." "I can't do that part." "I know." They walked the rest of the way across the tarmac without talking. Inside the terminal, the section was sorting kit and filling out the forms that followed every deployment, the bureaucratic afterlife of operational work, and Fiorentino was telling someone a story in the way he told stories. With his hands, with his whole face, with a volume that suggested the story involved something going wrong and turning out better than it should have. Gagnon was listening. He still had a slight stiffness in his left hand from the creak. It would probably come and go for years, the cold doing what cold did, but he was listening to Fiorentino with the expression of someone who had decided to find something funny for the first time in a while. Travers was at the equipment table. He looked up when she came in, and he nodded once. the particular nod that meant something specific between people who had been in the same difficult place and come back from it. She nodded back. Wick, his renovated ear tucked under a toque, handed her a coffee from the terminal dispenser without being asked, and it was terrible, which she expected, and she drank it anyway, which she also expected. She picked up her kit and found a table and started on the forms. Outside, the Ontario winter was doing what it always did, gray and persistent and requiring no one's permission. The tarmac was still wet. The lake was still out there, still cold, still indifferent to the schedules of military aircraft and the careers of individuals who had done difficult things in difficult places, and come home to forms and bad coffee and the quiet acknowledgement of people who had been watching more carefully than they had let on. She had a lot of forms to fill out. She filled them out. That was the job. That was always the job. Not the moment on the ridge, not the 6 hours of cold and wind and patience, not even the general's question or the warrant officer's 2 words or Colquhoun's careful answer in that fluorescent room. The job was all of it. The forms too, the tarmac, the terrible coffee, and she knew how to do all of it, and she had known for a long time, and she was, in the particular way of people who had spent years being certain of one thing while everything else was contested, exactly where she was supposed to be.